Let's take a look at another argument of roaming millennials now, the Asian American argument.
And something that I'd like to mention, which really debunks the idea that non-white people in the US are oppressed, is the fact that there are non-white groups out there who on average do better than their white counterparts in terms of education and finances. And yes, felony charges too.
So then, people of colour can't be oppressed because Asian Americans on average are better educated and have a higher average income than white Americans. Now, does this therefore prove that oppression is now a thing of the past and has no bearing at all on modern society? Well, I would argue quite the opposite. In fact, a larger percentage of Asian Americans being educated and having a higher average income stems directly from discrimination against Asian people. And stick with me now, it's kind of a counterintuitive one, this, I understand. How can discrimination against a group lead to them being, on average, better off down the line? And another question here before I answer that one. In the graph of average household incomes that Roaming Millennial showed, why doesn't the Asian data go back as far as the others? And these answers are linked, as you'll see. So I'm going to throw a few data points your way now, and we'll see if we can later draw some conclusions from them. So first of all, in 1960, the Asian population of the United States was less than 1 million. They comprised around half of 1% of the population. And this is compared to there being over 18 million black people in 1960, to give you a sense of the scale there. Today, there are around 20 million Asian Americans, so why were there so few, relatively, in 1960, and why are there comparatively so many more today? Point number 2. In 1882, the United States Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, prohibiting Chinese immigration into the United States and making the Chinese migrants present in the United States at the time permanent aliens by excluding them from the possibility of US citizenship. Point number 3. The Immigration Act of 1917, also known as the Asiatic Barred Zone Act, barred immigration from large parts of Asia completely. Point number 4. The Immigration Act of 1924, including the Asian Exclusion Act, but not to be confused with the Chinese Exclusion Act, imposed strict quotas on how many people of a particular nationality could be resident in the United States at the time, and barred completely everyone who was ineligible to become a United States citizen. Fifth, and finally here, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which removed the racial and national barriers that were previously in place, which restricted immigration from Asia. So then, why in 1960 were there a relatively small number of Asian people in the United States? And that's because immigration from Asia was massively restricted by a series of discriminatory laws. And then after those restrictions were lifted, immigration from Asia skyrocketed, relatively anyway. Now, the vast majority of Asian American population growth in recent decades has been due to immigration. So then, we need to ask, who can move to a different country? And primarily of importance to us here is people who can afford to move to a different country. And this is particularly true of a country very far away with which you do not share a land border. The average Chinese labourer cannot say, "Oh, I'm not feeling this really, I think I'll just move to America and buy a house and go to college." You see my point here. The United States is not seeing an accurate representative economic cross-section of people from those Asian countries that immigrants are arriving from. The immigrants are those that can afford to move and afford to pay for college, and this is reflected in the average income statistics. The disparity in average incomes present in the United States today is rooted in the history of these discriminatory laws. For a comparative example, imagine transplanting all the African Americans in the United States outside it, and then only allowing back in those that had the resources to make the move. And if you did that, the average household income for African Americans in the United States would increase dramatically. Not because they're actually any richer, remember, but simply because you'd be excluding all the poor people. I mean, poverty obviously still exists in Asia, doesn't it? Anyway, let's wrap up here. I feel like I've pitched enough answers to Roaming Millennial there for her to think about for one day. Now, this is a video I would actually like to see a response to. I want to know what Roaming Millennial or her fans think about what I've said and how they would answer me. I anticipate getting a fair amount of insults here, obviously, but I want to see arguments. If you think I'm wrong, Try and prove me wrong. If you think the studies I referenced came to incorrect conclusions, prove it. The ball's in your court. I'm eager for responses here since I feel like the right are just chasing their tails on this issue, and I want to try and move the conversation on. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone.
This world wasn't always so small and petty. Thousands of years ago, while the rest of men prayed to gods, the Valyrians became them. Through magic or sheer will, they mastered the greatest creatures in history. Dragons. Dragons. Dragons.
Dragon.
Dragons. Dragons. They mastered the greatest creatures. Dragons. 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 They mastered the greatest creatures. Dragons. Dragons.
As the sun sank below the horizon, all of Heron's men patrolled the battlements, hearing wings in every gust of wind. But the moon rose and sank, and no dragon appeared, and no dragon appeared.
Dragon. 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 Dragon.
sorry. Did I break your concentration? Oh, I'm sorry. Did I break your concentration? I didn't. Please, continue. You were saying something about best intention. What's the matter? Oh, you were finished. You were saying something about best intention.